I thought losing my dad was the worst thing I'd ever face until my half-brothers sued me for $16,000 0 cents for money they knew wasn't theirs. They dragged me through court, lied about our grandparents' will, and tried to erase my existence from the family. I felt completely alone until a stranger reached out with 3 words that changed everything. We share blood. That message didn't just save me, it exposed a truth my family had been hiding for decades. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button if you've ever been betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if your own family story took a turn you never expected, you're not alone here. This is a space for healing, truth, and finding the courage to fight back. My name is Emily, I'm 25, and I've always lived in the in-between. My father divorced my mom when I was 4 and remarried a woman who had 2 sons from a previous relationship. Together they had another child, which gave me 2 half-brothers and a stepbrother I barely knew. My father drifted in and out of my life after the divorce, popping up for birthdays and holidays when it was convenient. But my grandparents, Helen and George Smith Jones, made an effort to keep me tethered to that side of the family. They sent cards, made phone calls, and even showed up to my school plays when my dad didn't. So when the lawyer told me there was a trust in my name set aside by my grandparents years ago, I was shocked. The amount wasn't staggering, $16,000 0 cents, but to me, it meant more than money. It meant they hadn't forgotten me, that I mattered to them, that I was seen. The will said the money was for the biological grandchildren of Helen and George Smith Jones, and I was the only one who met that criteria. My half-brothers, Nathan and Kyle, were the children of my father's second marriage, but their mother wasn't related to my grandparents. On paper, it was simple. In reality, it was anything but. The moment they found out, Nathan and Kyle went ballistic. I hadn't even gotten the money yet before the texts started rolling in. Nathan accused me of manipulating our grandparents. Kyle went a step further, posting a rant on Facebook about entitled leeches who exploit the dead for a payday. It didn't take long before mutual friends started reaching out, asking what was going on. I kept quiet. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. I thought the noise would die down. I was wrong. 3 weeks later, I got served. My half-brothers were suing me, claiming the money should be split equally between all the kids, regardless of biological ties. They filed under emotional distress and alleged that our grandparents had meant to include them but were misled by me. It felt like I was being dragged into a family brawl I never asked for. I didn't even have a lawyer at first. I cried so hard the night I read the lawsuit, I gave myself a nosebleed. My mom, bless her, stepped in. She used what little savings she had to help me retain an attorney. "We'll figure this out," she said, but I could hear the worry in her voice. She was the one who'd picked up the pieces every time my dad disappointed me, the one who kept our tiny apartment running when there wasn't enough money for both rent and groceries. She'd spent decades shielding me from the ugliness of that side of the family, and now they were taking me to court. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. I'd never been in a courtroom before. The first hearing was surreal. Nathan and Kyle sat across from me in pressed suits like they were the victims. Their lawyer painted them as wounded sons unfairly cut out of a legacy. They said I'd alienated myself from the family, that I didn't care about anyone but myself. I wanted to scream. But my lawyer advised me to stay calm. Truth wins in the end, he said. I wasn't so sure. Then something strange happened. One day, I got a message on Instagram. It was from someone named Chris Mitchell. His profile was private, no posts, no mutual friends. The message said, "Hi, I know this is strange, but I think we might be related." At first, I thought it was a scam, another layer of drama, but curiosity got the better of me. I responded. Chris explained that he'd recently taken a DNA test through one of those ancestry sites and had matched with someone who was also matched with me. He said he'd been adopted at birth and was looking for his biological family. I didn't know what to say. I asked him for more details. Over the next few days, we exchanged messages. He sent me screenshots, records, and finally, photos. One of them showed a letter from an adoption agency dated 1994. The names on it, George and Helen Smith Jones, my grandparents. I didn't know how to process it. I called my mother and read the letter to her. She was silent for a long time. Then she whispered, "They must have had a child they gave up for adoption before your dad was born." It made sense. Chris was older than my father by a few years. That would have made him my uncle, technically, but we were only 6 years apart. And brought the information to my lawyer. He raised an eyebrow and said if he's legitimate, this could change everything. Chris agreed to take a second DNA test, and the results came back conclusive. He was a direct descendant of Helen and George, and since the trust specified biological grandchildren, that meant his children were also eligible, and he had two. When we submitted the new information to the court, Nathan and Kyle lost it. Their lawyer called it a stunt. They tried to have Chris's DNA results thrown out, but the judge allowed it. And just like that, I wasn't alone anymore. The pressure on me lifted. Suddenly, I wasn't the one person standing in the way of their imagined inheritance. I was just one of several people with a legal right to it. But what mattered more was emotional. Chris called me one night and said, I know we've never met, but I'm proud of you. I can't believe what they're putting you through. I broke down. After months of feeling alone, of being treated like an outsider and a villain, I had someone in my corner, someone who understood. The case dragged on for a few more weeks, but the judge ruled in our favor. The trust was upheld, the terms were clear, Nathan and Kyle had no claim, and Chris's family would now be included in the final disbursement. The courtroom was silent when the verdict was read. My half-brothers stormed out without looking at me. Afterward, I stood outside with Chris, watching the cars pass. We didn't say much at first. Then he turned to me and smiled. Funny how blood shows up when you least expect it. I smiled back. And stays, if you're lucky. That day, I didn't just win a court case. I found a part of myself I didn't know was missing, a family I didn't know I had. And in the ashes of betrayal, I built something stronger, connection, truth, and the courage to claim what was mine. When I saw the subject line, I think we might be siblings, I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or delete it out of panic. The timing felt almost cruel, just as my half-brothers were doing everything in their power to erase me. Some stranger shows up claiming blood. But something about it felt different. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't accusatory, it was tentative, like someone knocking on a door they're not sure they're allowed to open. I opened the message. Chris Mitchell introduced himself in a few brief paragraphs. He was 28, raised in a different state, and recently discovered through an ancestry DNA kit that he was likely the child of my father. He had no agenda, no demands, just questions. He said he wasn't sure what he hoped to find, but that the results had stunned him. His mother, he explained, had always been vague about the identity of his biological father. She once said he had another life and left it at that. Chris had lived his whole life with this hole in his identity, and now, thanks to a test he took out of curiosity, he believed he had found some answers. Must have read the message 10 times before I responded, and even then I kept it short. Hi, Chris, thanks for reaching out. I'm Emily, I think we need to talk. We agreed to video chat that weekend. When the screen lit up, I saw a man with kind eyes, an awkward smile, and a nervous energy that mirrored my own. We both stumbled through introductions, half laughing, half terrified. It was surreal. He didn't look like me exactly, but there were traces, something in the jawline, the way we both tilted our heads when we were unsure. Chris shared what he knew. His mother had a brief relationship with my father before he married either of our moms. She never pushed for child support, never tried to insert herself into his life. Chris grew up with a stepfather who treated him well enough, but he always felt like something was missing. The DNA test was a gift from a friend. He never expected it to explode his identity. As we spoke, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the fragile thread of connection that I'd always craved. I didn't know what to do with it yet, but I knew I didn't want to shut the door. After we ended the call, I sat in silence for a long time. My world was already spinning from the lawsuit, but now it felt like it had tilted in an entirely new direction. If Chris really was my half-brother, that changed things. Not legally, maybe, but emotionally, spiritually. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel entirely alone. I sent the DNA report to my lawyer. He was intrigued but cautious. It's not directly related to the lawsuit, he said, but it could be relevant if they tried to argue about the spirit of the will. As the lawsuit continued, Nathan and Kyle doubled down. They brought in a handwriting expert to challenge my grandfather's signature. They tried to subpoena old medical records. It was ridiculous, but exhausting. I was living in a pressure cooker, waking up with migraines and barely eating. Chris, meanwhile, stayed in touch. He didn't push, didn't insert himself. He was just there. He listened when I vented. He sent memes when I needed to laugh. And slowly we started to build something that felt like the very thing I'd been denied my whole life, siblinghood. One afternoon, I got a call from my lawyer. They're requesting a deposition, he said, and they've listed Chris as a potential witness. I nearly dropped the phone. They what? They must have found out, maybe through social media or court records. They want to argue that if Chris is a grandchild too, then the trust is invalid unless he's included. It was a dirty move. They weren't interested in including Chris. They wanted to weaponize him, use his existence to burn everything down. I called Chris immediately. You don't have to do anything, I told him. I'll tell them you're not involved. But Chris surprised me. I'll do it, he said quietly. If they're going to use me, I want to speak for myself. I'm not a pawn, and I'm definitely not on their side. The deposition was brutal. Their lawyer was smug and condescending, throwing out accusations like confetti. Chris kept his cool. He told the truth. He explained the DNA test, his relationship with his mother, and the timeline that supported everything. And when asked directly whether he believed he had any claim to the trust, he looked them dead in the eye and said, "This was never about money for me. It's about truth and respect." When he left the room, I burst into tears, not because I was scared, but because for the first time in this entire nightmare, someone had stood up for me. Unasked, unpaid, just because they believed in me. The case was nearing its end. My lawyer was confident. They've lost the narrative, he said. They look greedy and dishonest. You've handled this with grace. But the emotional toll had been steep. I'd lost sleep, weight, and faith in people. And yet somehow I'd gained a brother. One evening, Chris and I met in person for the first time. We hugged like we'd known each other forever. We spent hours swapping childhood stories, comparing notes, and marveling at the strange twists of fate that brought us together. We even visited my grandparents' old house, the one with the peeling paint and overgrown roses. We stood there side by side, paying our respects not just to them, but to the love they had planted in us, even if they never knew it would bloom this way. Back in court, the judge was preparing to rule. The final hearing was set. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Whatever happened next, I knew who I was. I wasn't alone anymore, and I wasn't afraid. Chris squeezed my hand before I walked into the courthouse. "Let's end this," he whispered. And I knew we would. I must have stared at that email subject line for a full 5 minutes before I opened it. "I think we might be siblings." I wasn't even sure it was real. I hovered my mouse over the sender's name, Chris Mitchell, and clicked. The message was short but cautiously worded. He introduced himself politely, said he recently discovered through a DNA test that we might share a father and wanted to know if I was open to talking. He attached a photo of himself, brown eyes like mine, a shy half smile, and a nervous energy even in the stillness of the image. Something about it disarmed me. I wasn't angry or suspicious. I was just curious. I replied the next morning. My message was cautious too, not because I didn't believe him, but because I was afraid to hope. I asked him a few basic questions: his age, what he knew, who his mother was. He responded quickly. His mother had had a brief relationship with my father years ago, before he married either of our moms. She'd passed away when Chris was in high school. He'd never known much about his father, only a name, and it wasn't until his wife gifted him a 23andMe test that the name Smith Jones popped up as a close match. That's when he started digging. That's when he found me. Part of me thought maybe it was a scam, but there was nothing about him that felt manipulative. He didn't ask for money or even mention the inheritance. He just said, "I figured if I had family out there, I'd want to know them, and it seems like you've been through a lot." That last line stayed with me. I agreed to a call. Talking to Chris felt like talking to an old friend. We laughed more than I expected. He was kind, thoughtful, and awkward in a way that made me feel safe. He told me about his life, how he grew up in Oregon, worked in IT, had a 3-year-old daughter, and a golden retriever named Max. He asked questions about my grandparents, about their personalities and quirks, as if he was collecting puzzle pieces he'd always been missing. And I shared everything. I found myself opening up to him in a way I hadn't done with anyone in months. Then I told him about the lawsuit. I didn't mean to. I hadn't planned on dumping all my problems on someone I just met. But when he asked why I sounded so exhausted, it just poured out. I told him about the trust fund, about Nathan and Kyle dragging me to court, about how our dad had stayed completely silent. Chris was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That's not right. You shouldn't be fighting this alone." We kept talking over the next few weeks, almost daily. Texts, late night calls, even a couple of Zooms where he met my cat Luna. In some strange, bittersweet way, he was filling a hole I didn't even know I had. I hadn't grown up with siblings in any real sense. Nathan and Kyle had always kept me at arm's length, and I'd learned to accept the crumbs of connection they threw my way. But Chris was different. It was, after all, a human. He was trying to fill a gap. It wasn't like he didn't treat me like I was a guest at the family table. He treated me like family. Eventually, I asked the question that had been lingering in my mind: would you be willing to take another DNA test, something more official? He agreed without hesitation. We ordered kits from a legal testing service and sent them off. 2 weeks later, the results came in. We were siblings, half, but still. Blood. I sat in silence after reading the report. A swirl of emotions hit me at once: relief, grief, anger, joy. My father had another child, a child he never claimed, a child who had been quietly walking through the world, wondering where he came from, while I had spent my life wondering why I never fully belonged. But this changed everything, not just emotionally, but legally. Chris and I talked that night for hours. We laughed, we cried, and then we got serious. He asked if the inheritance fund could possibly include him too. I wasn't sure. I pulled out the trust documents, reread the wording again and again. It clearly stated, "for biological descendants of Smith and Jones." If Chris was our father's biological son, he was just as much a Smith Jones grandchild as I was. I called the estate lawyer the next morning. When I explained everything and shared the DNA results, he was stunned, but also intrigued. "This could significantly strengthen your case," he told me. "Not only does it reinforce the legitimacy of your position, but it could also discredit the emotional manipulation your half-brothers are trying to use in court." He was right. Suddenly, I wasn't the lone outsider anymore. I had someone else, someone who had just as much of a claim to the family legacy, and maybe, just maybe, the judge would see through the entitled theatrics of Nathan and Kyle. When we brought the evidence forward, the courtroom energy shifted. Their lawyer was visibly flustered. Natham shot me a look of pure venom. Kyle just looked stunned. The judge paused the proceedings to review the documents and ordered an extension so they could be properly evaluated. Meanwhile, Chris flew out to meet me in person. When we hugged at the airport, I felt like I was hugging a version of myself, someone who'd been ignored, left out, written off. We talked for hours that night about our father, about what it meant to be siblings, about how strange and beautiful it was that we found each other like this through a lawsuit and a DNA test and a grief neither of us had processed completely. We made a decision. If the court upheld the trust and released the funds, we'd split them, not just between us, but a portion to set up a small scholarship fund in our grandparents' names, so that some other kid who felt like an outsider might have a shot at something better. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about making something whole, about reclaiming what had been broken. By the time the final court date arrived, I wasn't scared anymore. I had a brother, a real one, and I had finally found where I belonged. Weeks passed, and I expected the emotional dust to settle, but grief has a way of echoing even after the courtroom is silent. I'd won, legally, publicly, but inside, I still felt bruised. Some nights I'd wake up sweating, replaying old birthday parties in my head, ones where Nathan and Kyle got expensive gifts while I sat quietly, pretending not to notice. I remembered how Dad used to ruffle Kyle's hair and say, "That's my boy," while I stood on the sidelines hoping he'd remember to hug me too. Winning in court didn't erase the years of being invisible. It didn't remove the loneliness that came from being labeled the other daughter. It didn't fix the way my father looked through me like I was a stranger in his home. But something had shifted. A new rhythm was forming in my life, one that wasn't dictated by their silence or validation. Chris and I kept talking every day. At first, it was just updates, court paperwork, financial stuff, final distributions, but then it became more. We shared childhood stories, compared photos, even tried to piece together timelines of how our father had hidden us from each other. The overlaps were uncanny. Our birthdays were just a few weeks apart. We both loved mint chocolate chip ice cream. We both hated math. And neither of us had ever heard our father say the words, "I'm proud of you." One day, out of the blue, Chris sent me a voice memo. It was short. He just said, "I know we didn't grow up together, but I'm glad you exist." I didn't know how to respond to that. I played it 5 times in a row. Then I cried. Not the broken kind of crying I'd done during the lawsuit. This was different, softer. It felt like something old was healing. Around that same time, I got a letter in the mail from my father. There was a single page, typed, no greeting, no dear Emily, just a wall of detached words. He said he hadn't known how to respond when Chris came forward, that it had complicated things, that he wished the lawsuit hadn't gotten so messy, and that while he didn't agree with how I'd handled everything, he hoped I'd use the money wisely. That was it. No apology, no explanation, just corporate language from the man who gave me life. I wanted to burn it. Instead, I scanned it and sent it to Chris. His reply, "This man writes like HR at a soul-crushing job." We both laughed until it hurt. But that moment cemented something in me. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for closure, not for approval, not for the fairy tale where dad realized he'd been wrong all along and came running back with open arms. That wasn't going to happen. And that was okay. Because healing doesn't always look like a heartwarming reunion. Sometimes it looks like clarity, like choosing who you let into your circle, like realizing blood doesn't automatically entitle someone to your peace. I decided to do something symbolic. I used part of the inheritance, not a lot, just enough, to frame one of my grandmother's old handwritten letters. In it, she'd written, "Never forget you are enough just as you are." I hung it in my living room right above the couch. It's the first thing I see when I sit down at the end of a long day. It grounds me, reminds me where I come from and who I choose to be. Not long after Chris came to visit in person again, we spent the weekend doing all the cliche sibling things, arguing over movie choices, teasing each other about food preferences, even getting lost on a hiking trail and blaming each other for the bad directions. At one point, we sat on a rock overlooking a valley, and he said, I spent so many years thinking I didn't belong anywhere, but now I kind of do." I smiled. Me too. There's power in rewriting your story, in finding family in unexpected places, in refusing to carry bitterness, even when it's handed to you wrapped in betrayal. And most of all, there's power in surviving, not just the hard parts, but the lonely ones. When Nathan and Kyle's lawsuit failed, they lost more than money. They lost access to me, to my life, to my future. And maybe they don't care. Maybe they never will. But I do. I care enough to protect my peace, to choose connection over resentment, to build a new chapter where love is earned, not demanded, by DNA. And that's exactly what I'm doing. A few months passed, and for the first time in what felt like years, I had silence in my life, but the kind of silence that soothes rather than suffocates. There were no emails from lawyers, no calls from dad, no cryptic texts from Nathan or Kyle, just space. And in that space, I began rediscovering the parts of me that had gone quiet under the weight of conflict. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. I wasn't great, but there was something healing in the mess of colors, something honest. On some days, I'd paint with Chris sitting on the floor beside me, tapping away at his laptop, both of us lost in our own little creative bubbles, but grounded in each other's presence. Other days, I'd walk through the park alone with a coffee, no destination, just air in my lungs and no court dates to prepare for. But the quiet didn't last forever. One night, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was Kyle. His voice was tense, strained. "Emily," I didn't know who else to call. I froze. He told me Nathan had been hospitalized, something with his heart, a complication from stress and overwork, possibly made worse by the legal ordeal they dragged us all through. I listened, quiet, unsure what he wanted from me. And he said, I just thought you should know you're still family no matter what happened. Family, the word hung in the air like smoke. I wanted to snap, to remind him of the lies, the lawsuit, the accusations, to ask if family sues you over money that was never theirs to begin with. But I didn't. I simply said, I hope he recovers, and hung up. Afterwards, I sat on my couch for a long time, heart pounding, fingers trembling, not out of fear, but out of the sudden realization that I didn't feel anger anymore, just distance, like I'd already moved on without even realizing it. So this anger was already gone. When I told Chris about the call, he frowned. Are you okay? I think so. I said, I don't think I want that version of family anymore. Chris nodded slowly, like he understood something deeper than I was saying. Sometimes you have to walk away from the fire to stop smelling like smoke. That line stayed with me. I wrote it in my journal, underlined it twice. Later that week, I donated a portion of the inheritance to a local youth support program, one that helped teens navigating family conflict and emotional trauma. It felt right. It felt full circle. Because I knew what it meant to grow up feeling like the outsider. I knew what it meant to have people smile to your face while erasing your place in their story. And I knew how hard it was to find your own voice when your own father didn't want to hear it. But now, I wasn't voiceless. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I had chosen myself. Chris and I decided to visit our grandparents' old house, the one that had been sold years ago, now repainted and reshaped by a new family. We didn't go inside, just stood across the street and looked at it. The porch swing was gone, the garden had different flowers, but something about it still felt sacred. We sat in the car, sipping iced tea, and Chris said, if they could see us now, do you think they'd be proud? I smiled. I think they already were. They just wanted us to remember who we were, even when others tried to rewrite our story. That night, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known before, not because everything had been fixed, but because I no longer needed it to be. A few weeks after that quiet night with Chris and the cupcakes, something shifted inside me. I stopped waiting for apologies. I stopped hoping my half-brothers would come around or that my dad would suddenly become the man I needed years ago. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the burning, venomous way I'd been during the lawsuit. I was just done. I started unpacking the boxes I'd left untouched for months, the ones filled with old photos, childhood drawings, and birthday cards I could never bring myself to throw away. As I sifted through them, I saw pieces of a girl who had always tried to earn her place, who smiled through disappointment, stayed quiet to keep the peace, and twisted herself into knots trying to belong. I didn't want to be her anymore. So I made a decision. I reached out to a therapist, something I had told myself I didn't need, but in truth, I did, not because I was broken, but because I was finally ready to heal, not just from the lawsuit or the betrayal, but from years of emotional abandonment that I had buried beneath, I'm fine. Therapy was hard, but it gave me language for things I'd never had words for, like how grief isn't just about losing people, but also losing the version of life you thought you were owed, or how sometimes closure isn't a moment, it's a choice. Meanwhile, Chris and I got closer. What started as cautious connection turned into something I'd never had with anyone in my family: unconditional presence. He'd check in without a reason, show up without asking, and never once made me feel like I had to earn his care. It was strange and healing at the same time. One afternoon, he brought over a faded leather photo album. Found this in a box from my mom's attic, he said, setting it on my coffee table. We flipped through it together, pictures of a younger version of my dad with a woman I didn't recognize, Chris' mom. The resemblance between us in some of those old snapshots was undeniable. Same jawline, same crooked half smile. It was surreal, like discovering a missing puzzle piece that had been in the wrong box the whole time. That night, I wrote in my journal something I hadn't dared to say aloud yet. Maybe family isn't about blood. Maybe it's about who stays, who shows up, and who sees you. That became my new North Star. The lawsuit eventually fizzled out. A judge dismissed their claim, citing the clarity of the will and the baselessness of their accusations. I didn't celebrate. I didn't throw it in their faces. I just let it end quietly, finally. Nathan and Kyle went back to their lives. I heard Kyle moved out of state. Nathan stopped posting anything public. The silence was its own kind of peace. I never got the money. The trust fund was frozen during litigation and legal fees devoured most of it. But oddly, I didn't care. What I gained was worth more than any inheritance: my own voice, my truth, and a brother who showed up when it mattered most. I started to build something new, a life not defined by who hurt me, but by who healed beside me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Months passed and the dust finally settled. No more letters from lawyers, no more phone calls filled with tension, just stillness, peace, the kind I hadn't felt since before all of this started. And in that peace, I learned something I didn't expect. I wasn't angry anymore, not at Nathan or Kyle, not even at my dad. I was tired, but I was also stronger. Chris and I started a quiet tradition: Sunday breakfast at the same small cafe down the street. It became our sacred space. No talk about lawsuits or betrayals, just laughter, coffee, and stories about the lives we were now choosing to build. He wasn't just a brother in name, he was family in action. And maybe in some strange way, the chaos had to happen so I could find him. I remember one morning looking out the cafe window at the people passing by, couples holding hands, a dad helping his toddler with a juice box, two teenagers fighting over a muffin, and I felt something crack open inside me. A thought I had buried deep finally came up. I didn't need to prove my worth to anyone anymore. Not to my half-brothers who tried to take from me what was rightfully mine. Not to my father who spent his life looking the other way. Not to a family name that felt more like a wound than a legacy. Because I had already done the hardest thing. I stood up for myself, I fought when no one else did, and in the end, I walked away with my dignity intact, my heart healing, and my future wide open. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. It did, deeply. But sometimes the most painful endings give birth to the most meaningful beginnings. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real inheritance my grandparents left me. Not money, not documents, but the strength to stand up, speak up, and walk away when I needed to. If you've ever had to fight for something that was already yours, if you've been betrayed by people who were supposed to protect you, or if you've had to build a new version of family from scratch, this story is for you, and maybe someone out there needs to hear it too. So don't keep it to yourself, share it. And if it resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Tell us what you've survived, what you've rebuilt, or who finally showed up when you needed them most. Your story might be the reminder someone else needs to believe they're not alone. Thanks for listening, and remember, sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you were given.